Grant Amato's case is usually described as a man who became obsessed with a cam girl, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on her, and murdered his family when they tried to make him stop. And that is part of the story. But I think the deeper pattern is darker. This case is really about what happens when fantasy becomes identity. When a paid online relationship starts to feel more real than the actual family standing right in front of you. Hi, my name is Dina. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new here. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing and psychologically layered family annihilation cases in recent memory. Let's start at the beginning. Grant Amato was 29 years old when his parents and brother were murdered in January of 2019. Before that, he had been working as a registered nurse. From the outside, he may not have looked like someone who would become the center of a family annihilation case. He had a profession, a supportive family, two brothers, and a place in the family home in Chuluoja, Florida. But in 2018, his life began to unravel. Grant was suspended and then fired from his nursing job at Advent Health Orlando after being accused of stealing prescription medication. Bad loss of structure and purpose marked a turning point. After losing his job, Grant expressed interest in becoming a streamer. He attempted to pursue live streaming on Twitch, mostly playing video games. His family, trying to support him, brought him a significant computer setup, monitors, cameras, and equipment. Instead of building a streaming career, however, Grant used the new setup and free time to explore adult websites. It was there, around June of 2018 on My Free Cams, that he began communicating with a woman named Sylvie, a Bulgarian cam model.
Online.
Who's she?
She's as embarrassing as it is. She's a cam model.
A what?
A cam model. Do
All right.
either of you guys know what that
Nope.
is?
Just like all the videos, you have to tell us.
A cam model. It's like it's like a virtual girlfriend, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Like that type of situation.
Mm-hmm.
So
Now, I want to pause here for a moment because the wording matters. If Sylvia is described only as a cam girl, the story sounds like familiar adult entertainment. But that does not appear to be how Grant experienced it. He described her as his girlfriend. That detail changes the psychological shape of the story. Once a paid interaction is interpreted as a real relationship, the fantasy is no longer just entertainment.
describe it as.
Right. I was told that you would not have access to be able to contact this woman. Why do you feel the intent to still contact her?
It was just the whole emotional thing. I mean, that's all
Okay.
that I can say.
So are you saying that you love the woman?
I feel like I did, yeah.
Okay. You feel like you...
It becomes something the person feels deeply attached to, something they feel protective of and entitled to defend. At that point, anyone who challenges the fantasy can start to feel like they are attacking the relationship itself. This was not simply about spending money. This was not simply about adult entertainment either. The online connection became emotionally central to Grant's identity and daily life. Grant didn't just pay for her attention. He crafted an entirely different identity to match the fantasy. He presented himself to Sylvie as a wealthy, successful professional gamer and Twitch streamer living an independent, luxurious life. In reality, he was an unemployed former nurse stealing from his family to maintain the illusion. This wasn't just financial deception. It was identity deception. The version of Grant that Sylvie knew only existed inside that screen. And he became increasingly desperate to protect that version of himself. Prosecutors later argued that Grant fell in love with Sylvie and became obsessed with her, to the point that she was all that mattered. That phrase is important, all that mattered, because this is where the replacement pattern begins. A fantasy does not have to be physically present to become emotionally dominant. Sometimes distance actually strengthens it. The person on the other side of the screen doesn't have to deal with the bills, the consequences, the job loss, the family conflict, or the accountability. They can remain idealized. They can become a perfect projection. And the more someone invests in that projection, the harder it becomes to tolerate reality interrupting it. For Grant, that investment became financial very quickly. He spent more than $200,000 on Sylvie, primarily through tokens on the campsite, private sessions, photos, and videos. He also allegedly sent gifts, including clothing and sex toys. But that money did not come from a stable income. According to investigators, it came from his family. The fantasy identity required resources that real life could not support. And once that happens, the person eventually reaches a breaking point. Either the fantasy has to shrink or the reality has to be bent around it. Grant appears to have chosen the second option. The money is usually the headline here, more than $200,000. That number is shocking, and it should be, but by itself it doesn't show the full pattern. Because this wasn't only reckless spending. The money was allegedly coming from the people closest to Grant, his parents, his brother Cody, and other relatives. That is the point where the fantasy begins spreading outward. After losing his nursing job, Grant's access to the expensive computer setup gave him both time and tools to deepen his involvement with Sylvie. In the final 3 months before the murders, Grant reportedly stole large sums of money from his parents and brother and wired it to Bulgaria. He initiated loans and lines of credit, including one in his father's name and a loan against the family home for more than $50,000. Grant Amato, his father, discovered the loans but allowed them to go through, so his son would not face grand theft charges. His brother Cody's girlfriend told investigators Grant had stolen tens of thousands from Cody and sold his guns without permission. Grant also stayed with his Aunt Donna at one point and stole her credit card information. His family begged Donna not to press charges. They promised to repay the money, and they did. We could already see the family absorbing consequences that Grant himself was not absorbing. They were trying to protect him from legal trouble and hold the family together. The loan against the family home was a stark example of this protection, but every rescue came with a cost. Rescue can buy time, but it can also allow the damage to keep growing underneath. By that point, Grant's fantasy was costing his family their security, their house, their finances, their peace. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not diagnosing Grant or trying to diagnose Grant, but as a pattern, this is significant. When workplace theft, family theft, credit card misuse, compulsive spending, prolonged unemployment, and escalating conflict at home all appear in the same timeline, it is no longer one bad decision. It is a collapse across multiple areas of life. The fantasy was no longer staying inside the screen. It was reorganizing his real life around it. One relationship that becomes especially important in this timeline is Grant's relationship with his father, Chad. After Grant lost his job, Chad became increasingly frustrated that his son had not found another one. Grant later told detectives that his father would come home from work and talk to him every day about getting his life together, finding a job, and dealing with the situation. From Grant's perspective, it may have felt like constant pressure, but from the family's perspective, Chad was watching his adult son lose his career, steal massive amounts of money, drain the household financially, and prioritize an online relationship over real responsibilities. Chad became the primary voice of reality in the home. In a mind where fantasy is fused with identity, that role becomes dangerous. The person naming reality starts to feel like the person destroying the fantasy. Another important rupture point happened about a month before the murders, during a trip to Japan that Grant took with Cody and one of Cody's friends. According to trial coverage, that trip became one of the moments where Cody began seeing more clearly what was happening behind the scenes. Grant had reportedly disappeared during the trip, and when Cody found him, more of the truth began coming out, including what Grant had been spending money on and how deeply he had built his life around this fantasy relationship. That matters because Cody was not just a brother in the background. He became one of the people closest to the truth. He had reportedly given Grant thousands of dollars to help him, but after the trip, Cody confided in their parents about what Grant had been doing. And from there, the family's response escalated. The hidden fantasy life was no longer hidden. It had become visible, expensive, disruptive, and impossible for the family to ignore. Before the final rupture, the family had tried extensive rescue. They repaid stolen money, begged relatives not to press charges, absorbed enormous financial strain, and even remortgaged the family home. In December 2018, when their fear peaked, they reported Grant missing out of concern he might harm himself. They then took him to a treatment facility focused on internet and sex addiction. The program was reportedly 60 days, but Grant checked out after less than 2 weeks. When he returned home in early January 2019, the family shifted to tough love. They set clear, firm boundaries. He had to get a job, attend therapy, stop expecting them to pay his debts, and completely end communication with Sylvie. Those rules were not random. They directly targeted the places where the fantasy had overtaken reality. The family was trying to rebuild structure and put the real world back in charge, but Grant experienced the rules as deeply unfair. He told investigators it was unfair that he could not contact Sylvie because she was his girlfriend. That single statement reveals the collision at the heart of this case. To the family, Sylvie was a paid fantasy that had cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars and was destroying their home. To Grant, she was his girlfriend. Those two realities could not coexist. What happened next appears to have been the final breaking point. Even after the rules were set, Grant convinced his mother, Margaret, to let him use her phone to contact Sylvie on Twitter. When Chad discovered this on January 24, 2019, he enforced the consequence. He ordered Grant to pack his belongings and leave the house. But Chad went further. He located Sylvie's contact information and reached out to her directly. He told her the truth, that Grant was not the wealthy, successful professional gamer and streamer that he had claimed to be, that he had been stealing from his family, including loans against the family home to fund their interactions. Sylvie reportedly cut off all communication with Grant. In that moment, Grant didn't just lose access. The family had destroyed the entire fantasy identity he had built in her eyes. The successful, desirable, powerful version of himself, the one that only existed on the screen, was exposed as a lie. From Grant's perspective, this was ultimate betrayal. They hadn't just kicked him out. They had erased the one reality where he felt important and loved. On January 24th, after the final confrontation, Chad wrote a list of rules for the house. On that list, he included one devastating line. You chose a stranger, physically non-existent, over family. That sentence compresses the entire tragedy. According to reports, that line was later scratched out on the note. The next day, January 25th, 2019, deputies were called to the Amato home after Cody failed to show up for work. Inside, they found Chad, Margaret, and Cody dead, all shot execution style in the head. The scene had been staged to look like Cody had killed his parents and then himself. Grant was not at the house. He was later located at a hotel. Prosecutors argued that there was no forced entry. The evidence pointed to Grant, and cell phone data supported their timeline. The jury ultimately convicted him of 3 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. One of the most striking details from Grant's interrogation is what he did not do. According to investigators, he never asked what had happened to his family. He showed no visible urgency, confusion, or panic about his parents and brother. When detectives placed photos of the crime scene in front of him,
Did you leave the house with your brother Cody looking like that? Or did you leave the house with your father looking like that? Or your mother?
Grant denied involvement. Even when his surviving brother Jason spoke with him, Grant continued to deny responsibility. I want to be very careful here. People react to trauma and interrogation in unpredictable ways, but placed inside the full pattern, the escalating theft, the secret contact, the final exposure of his fantasy, and the immediate timing, the absence of visible concern becomes part of the emotional picture. It suggests that, by that point, the fantasy attachment had reordered Grant's emotional hierarchy. The deepest and most disturbing pattern in this case is what I call obstacle conversion. At first, the Amato family tried desperately to rescue Grant. They covered stolen money, protected him from legal consequences, took him to treatment, worried about his mental health, and bought him expensive equipment, hoping it would give him purpose. His brother Cody, who had been especially close to Grant, was one of the people Grant allegedly stole money from, yet he still tried to support and connect with his brother. But once the fantasy had become central to Grant's identity, those same rescue efforts were reframed inside his mind. Support became control. Concern became persecution. Boundaries became betrayal. The people trying to save him became the obstacle standing between him and the fantasy life he refused to give up. This is why Chad's line carries such weight. The family was not cruel. They were simply insisting on reality. But when fantasy has replaced reality, reality itself becomes the enemy. Years later, while serving a life sentence, Grant Amato's name surfaced again in a disturbing new context. In 2025, he was allegedly linked to a murder-for-hire plot involving Victoria Goodwin, the estranged wife of Aaron Goodwin from Ghost Adventures. According to reports, the two had been communicating romantically through a contraband phone. The alleged plan once again involved removing a real-life spouse positioned as the obstacle to the relationship. We must be careful, of course. This remains a separate legal matter. But from a pattern perspective, the echo is chilling. Once again, a remote, screen-mediated attachment. Once again, a family member cast as the barrier. Once again, violence allegedly discussed as a solution. This is not ultimately a story about one can model. It is a story about what happens when fantasy becomes identity and reality is treated as the threat. Screens can intensify this danger. They offer intimacy without accountability, validation without vulnerability, and a version of the self that feels more bearable than real life. I want to be very clear. This is not about blaming Sylvie. She did not cause these murders. The responsibility lies entirely with the person who pulled the trigger. The Amato family tried for a long time to save Grant. They rescued, they enabled, They confronted, and finally they set boundaries. When they did, the fantasy allegedly won in Grant's mind. That is a tragedy. And not only that Grant chose the fantasy over his family, but that his family had been trying to pull him back the entire time. The most haunting line in the case may still be Chad Amato's. You chose a stranger, physically non-existent, over family. That single sentence contains the entire tragedy. Grant Amato's family was not killed by a stranger on a screen. They were killed after he chose what that screen represented over the real people who loved him. Years later, the alleged prison plot makes the pattern even harder to dismiss. In the Amato family, the people erased were Chad, Margaret, and Cody. 3 real people who tried to save their son and brother. This was not just obsession. It was replacement. And once fantasy replaced family, the people trying to pull him back into reality became the threat. So what do you think? Have you seen similar patterns in other stories? Where do you think the line is between support and enabling? When should families switch from rescue to tough love? Please like the video if it gave you something to think about. Share it with others who are interested in these kinds of cases. And subscribe for more. See you in the next one.